episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor. Welcome, everybody, once again to another episode, bringing you another truly fascinating guest, helping to create a better tomorrow on many different fronts. Today, we have the honor of being joined by the extremely multi-talented Professor Johnjoe McFadden, Professor of Molecular Genetics, University of Surrey in the UK. With his Ph.D. in Biochemistry, Professor McFadden has spent many years doing in-depth research in areas such as microbial genetics, studying the agents of tuberculosis, meningitis. He's invented many important tests for these agents, has published hundreds of scientific articles on a wide range of subjects, including but not limited bacterial genetics, tuberculosis, idiopathic diseases, computer modeling of evolution, all along the way editing a book of the genetics of mycobacteria and systems biology of tuberculosis. And he's been instrumental in many other areas, creating new models of human consciousness, such as his CEMI Theory, conscious electromagnetic information field, as well as working in the extremely cutting-edge field of quantum biology. Has lectured extensively around the world, been featured on numerous radio, television, and newspaper forums, and he's become a prolific author. His existing books, Quantum Evolution, Life in the Multiverse, and Life on the Edge, The Coming Age of Quantum Biology, are fascinating, and he has a new book out right now, Life is Simple, How Occam's Razor Set Science Free and Helps Shape the Universe, or Shapes the Universe. Lots of exciting things to talk about. Professor Johnjoe McFadden, thanks for coming to join us today.
Thank you for inviting me, Ira.
It's great to see you. It's been a couple of years, but the last time we had a chance to chat, we were off talking about quantum biology. However, today we're going in a different direction, and I'd love to start things off by how you journeyed north a little bit from Surrey to sort of find the village of Ockham, and introduce us to who William of Ockham, the Franciscan friar, was.
Yes. So William of Ockham was, as you mentioned, Ira, a Franciscan friar. He was born around about 1285, and his origins are somewhat obscure, which probably suggests they were also somewhat humble. He was given to the Franciscan order, which was often the fate of illegitimate children, orphans, and then was educated first in a Franciscan friary, but then he was sent to Oxford. It had only been set up about less than 100 years before, sent to Oxford to study theology. And this is where I think it gets interesting, because at the time, theology was called the Queen of Sciences, which is very strange to us, but entirely normal in the medieval world. In fact, entirely more normal through most of human history, and still in many parts of the world today, where there isn't really any distinction with the way we understand the world in science and the way we understand the world in religion, metaphysics, theology, etc. So that's a subject he went to study, and to give you a flavour of it, the kind of questions that he would have had to answer in his syllabus, if you like, were questions such as, what are angels made of? What are the gates of hell made of? So these were kind of semi-scientific in that they clearly treated what we would consider to be spiritual entities that either have no existence or a non-material existence, and tried to make sense of them. Are they made of matter and form, for example? Much of that was imported, the science that they were using was imported from the Greek world, and particularly the rediscovery of Aristotle about a century or so earlier. And one of the greatest theologians of the medieval world, Thomas Aquinas, had been particularly enraptured by Aristotle and his work, and more or less Christianized this pagan philosopher Aristotle. So he was considered and is described as, in, for example, Dante's Divine Comedy, as the master of all those who know. And so he was treated with extreme reverence in Christian circles, largely through the work of theologians such as Thomas Aquinas. who had, for example, used Aristotle's science to prove God, or so he claimed. So, for example, Aristotle said everything that moves is moved by another. And if you trace that backwards, you have to come to what was called the prime mover, the first mover, the entity that started everything moving. And that's Aristotle left it as the prime mover. It became imported into Christianity and became the Christian God. So that was one of Aquinas's proofs of God. Another one was another idea that Aristotle had come up with. Actually came from Plato and then was brought in, slightly changed by Aristotle, that everything has a cause, a purpose. So everything in the world has a purpose. And the purpose of acorns, for example, was to feed pigs. The purpose of pigs was to feed humans. And in the Christian world, the purpose of humans was to worship God. So the purposes of everything and everything in the world, from sticks and stones, they all have purposes, to the stars in the sky, they all have purposes and they all lead to God. So that was then a pathway to God, to knowledge of God. If you could understand these purposes, then you could understand God. So this is how it kind of became a science, that study of the world was also a path to God. Anyway, the first thing that William of Ockham did when he arrived at Oxford, pretty much the first thing, was to dismiss all of Aquinas's proofs of God. He disproved all of them. He, for example, said the prime mover argument doesn't prove anything because there may be no prime mover. We accept God as being not requiring a prime mover, so why not the universe? There may be multiple prime movers. There may be 100 different things, 1,000, million different things that might have individually caused objects to move. So it doesn't really tell us anything about a God. As for the purpose, which incidentally is what we call today teleology, the belief that the world is full of purpose. He said, no, it isn't. There are no purposes except those made by man. So you can talk about the purpose of a house, but there's no point in talking about the purpose of an acorn. It's just there. Or a fire. He said a fire is hot because it's a fire. That's in its nature. It doesn't have a purpose in being hot. So he got rid of teleology as a route to God. He got rid of dismissed all the proofs of God. And he also then went on to kind of say, look, science and religion are separate and shouldn't be confused. Science is based on reason. And you shouldn't bring theology, religion into it. It's just based on reason. Theology, he was a Franciscan friar. As far as we know, a devout man throughout his life. He never doubted God. But he said, when you come to religion, it's all based on faith. You can't reason your way to God. There's no path from reason to get to God. So he said that faith, religion, is all based on scriptures, the Holy Fathers, what they had said. That's the only way you can get to God. So then he separated studying the world into two distinct spheres. And as far as I know, he was the first person in the history of the world to do this and say science is on one side, that's reason. Religion is on the other side, that's faith. So that was one of the things he did. That, as he was here in a moment, got him into trouble. Another thing was, there's another aspect of Aristotle's learning that, and this brings in what he's most famous for, Occam's razor.
Sure.
And to a certain extent, he used Occam's razor also to dismiss teleology. So Occam's razor is the principle made famous really by William of Ockham, that pick the simplest solution. So, for example, he used it on teleology. You don't need teleology to explain anything, so get rid of it as an idea. There's no evidence for it in the world. It isn't needed to explain anything, so he used his razor to say, get rid of it, get it out of your science. Similarly, there was another important philosophical entity, if you like, in the medieval world, and that's something called universals, what Plato called forms. And Plato came up with this idea when he was asking the question, well, how do we recognize objects as members of their class? So, for example, cats are very different. Each cat is different, and yet we recognize them as cats. Triangles can be lots of different shapes and sizes, and there's still triangles. What is it we recognize? Circles, similarly, spheres, any object. We have no difficulty recognizing them, but how? They're imperfect, they're never the same. And Plato came up with the idea, very influential in Western philosophy, of forms, that behind the real world is a hidden world of ultimate realities, of triangles and circles and spheres and cats and dogs and donkeys, the perfect object of these, a world of perfect forms. Aristotle, Plato's pupil, took on this idea, but whereas Plato had his forms in a kind of heaven, some kind of mystical place that we don't really know quite where he thought the forms lived, some sphere of existence. But Aristotle said, no, they're in objects. So, for example, if a cherry has forms of redness, which he then called universals. So a universal of redness, a universal of roundness, a universal of sweetness, a universal of everything else, every aspect of a cherry. And then science in the medieval world was really about chasing these universals and finding out, okay, if I take a sword, for example, what is it? What are its universals? Royalty had its own universals. So people who were royal kings, they had this universal of kingship, of royalty, which they passed on to their children. So it's important in the social structure of the medieval world. Serfs, essentially slaves, were born with a universal of serfdom. They were born to serve. So this was fundamental to the medieval world order, and it is also another route to God, because universals, when they were Christianized, were ideas in God's mind. So again, if you understood the universals, then you could understand a little bit of God's mind and you were getting a bit closer to God. Occam used his razor to dismiss these as well. He kind of said, okay, well, cherries come in pairs usually. You get pairs of cherries. So they have the universal two-ness as well as the redness and the sweetness. So you have universals of number. And he said, okay, if I have two chairs in a room, and I have a third chair in another room, and I knock down the wall between them, then the universal of two-ness that they previously had has now become a universal of three-ness. And that just doesn't make sense. So he said they don't make sense. They're not necessary to explain anything at all, so get rid of them. And that completely undermined much of medieval philosophy, which was really about chasing these universals. And this is what theologians of the medieval world did. They spent realms and realms of parchment and pints and pints of ink on discussing these universals. And William of Ockham said, no, they don't exist. And this was a blow to the church because they were using these universals to explain miracles, for example. And William of Ockham said, they don't exist. They're a figment of your imagination. Get rid of them. So he was accused of heresy because it kind of undermined many of the facets of the Catholic Church, many of the teachings of the Catholic Church. And he had to go to Avignon to answer charges and go on trial for heresy in front of the Pope. Pope was in Avignon at the time, the French popes, one of the 9 French popes. But he ended up accusing the Pope of being a heretic and then getting chased out of Avignon by papal soldiers and sought the protection of the Holy Roman Emperor, who was crowning his own Pope in Rome. These were colourful times. So he has this interesting history of being a rather dogged logician. He just was considered himself as being a master of logic. And he used his logic, and particularly his razor, of getting rid of anything you don't want, with great rigor. And that was picked up by scientists, some during William of Ockham's lifetime, for example, someone called Jean Bourgon in France, who was another theologian, but who worked in Paris. he was the first person I know, at least I know, and again, people can correct me on this, he at least considered that the reason why everything appears to turn around the Earth every day, like the stars rotate around the Earth every day, so does the moon and the sun. He said, well, actually, it would be easier if we allowed the Earth to spin and kept all of these stars and moon and Earth still.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be simpler. And his sole argument for it was Occam's razor. He was an Occamist scholar only decades before William of Ockham had been charged with heresy. And he was already making these kind of Occamist steps forward towards modern science by saying, actually, instead of having everything rotating around the Earth at the center, let's keep the Earth, allow the Earth to spin, and then they can all stand still. And isn't that a simpler solution? So that was William of Ockham, really, and his immediate impact. But that was carried forward into subsequent scientific advances.
And you know, Johnjoe, you take the reader on this journey through, you know, from Copernicus, Newton, Darwin, Einstein to Higgs, from, you know, look at the universe, the standard model particle physics. But interestingly, you know, you start off early on, not too far from here, actually, in Holmdel, New Jersey, where Penzias and Wilson, you know, accidentally, no, it wasn't birds, it wasn't bird dander. They accidentally discover the cosmic microwave background radiation. Kind of like Occam in reverse here on this one. But talk about why you talk about this case at the beginning of the book.
Yeah. So this is right at the opening. It was one of my entries into thinking about William of Ockham and the razor and the notion of simplicity. And this was the remarkable discovery, as you say, by Penzias and Wilson, who had been set up this horn antennae in Holmdel, as you say. Well, they hadn't set it up. It had been donated to them for a while to do some studies by Bell Laboratories, who had set it up as a way of looking at whether they could use microwaves for telecommunication. That didn't really work out, so they loaned it out to scientists. And Penzias and Wilson thought that they could map a sky in the microwave radiation frequencies. And the first thing they wanted to do was, you know, when you start a new instrument, you don't want any signal to begin with. So you, if you like, zero your system on a negative sample. And that was an area of the sky that was dark, had hardly any stars. So they thought, okay, this should be quiet in the microwave region, because they thought microwaves might be coming from stars. But space shouldn't have any. Space shouldn't have microwaves. So they pointed it at this dark spot, and they got a hiss. Instead of getting negative, they got this uniform kind of buzz of microwave radiation coming out of the darkness of space itself. And everywhere they turned, they got that same uniform hiss of microwave radiation. As you say, they tried out all sorts of things, whether it be bird poop, I think you say, dander, and whether it could be nuclear installations nearby, New York City, all of these kind of things they looked at, and they still couldn't get rid of this hiss, and they were baffled. And meanwhile, Robert, I think Dick, isn't it? Forgetting my names, but Dickey, who had one of the people who invented microwave antennae, he was working not so far away and on looking at the problem of trying to make sense of the conflict in cosmology, drifted into cosmology, between the steady state hypothesis and the Big Bang hypothesis. So this was because all set off by the discovery that the universe was expanding. So fantastic, extraordinary discovery that the universe appears to be expanding. How do we make sense of it? One of the ways was promoted by particularly Fred Hoyle, who said that the universe is expanding and more space is being created and more matter is being created to fill in the holes, if you like. So it's a steady state theory. The expansion is balanced by a constant creation of new matter and space. And then there was a Big Bang theory that said, no, if you take the expansion and run it backwards in time, you get to a tiny, tiny point from which the universe emerged, the Big Bang. And those two theories gave very similar predictions, but Robert Dick realized that the Big Bang should have left a kind of smoking gun of radiation by this time, 14 billion years or so later, should have been in the microwave region. So he set out to pick up to see if he could detect this, and he and his colleagues worked on developing very sensitive microwave detectors. Meanwhile, Penzias and Wilson had already been detecting this hiss, and they heard about Dickey's work and his looking for this smoking gun of the Big Bang, and they phoned him up and said, look, we've got this hiss out of our great big microwave detector, and we just can't seem to get zero signal out of it, and it's just constant signal throughout the sky. And by the time Dickey had finished the phone call, he realized they had discovered the Big Bang, that they'd beaten to it, and they of course got the Nobel Prize for the discovery. So that was the Big Bang, and it's really, if you like, the cosmic microwave background is a photograph of the universe, and it's very, very early, within moments.
Yep.
And what is clear then is that this photograph, although we see it and we often see pictures of it, and it's got light regions and dark regions and kind of strings running through it, in fact, it's very, 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 very smooth. Mm-hmm. If it was white paper, it would be the smoothest, whitest paper you have ever seen. So it's a very, very smooth background, and can be described by just a single number, which is the frequency of any undulations, which are in the tiny, tiny undulations in the microwave background. So what got me thinking about this was listening to Neil Turok, and cosmologist Neil Turok, who was talking about this on a podcast, and said that the universe started off, at least, in this extraordinarily simple state, so simple, as he put it, that we don't know how the universe got away with it. Mm-hmm. And that made me think, okay, the universe was born really simple, mm-hmm. and now it's become really complex. But is there still some trace of this simplicity, that the universe was born simple, and at some level it might remain simple? So this is one of the angles which I took on my interest in my exploration of the notion of simplicity. And at this time, I was already thinking about it from the other side, having become interested in Occam's razor, the role of Occam's razor in science. And I thought it was a good way to kind of set the scene of that the universe started off simple. Mm-hmm. It's not so simple, but do we still have some kind of simple bones in the universe that we can still investigate?
Continuing on that theme, and obviously, once again, you study a wide range of thought leaders throughout time. But I love your work, and thinking back to our past discussions in quantum biology, where you research topics like magnetonavigation, olfaction, photosynthesis, consciousness. Very complex topics. How do you wield Occam's razor in your own research when you come to these extremely bleeding edge areas of biology and physics?
Well, this it was a revelation to me that I used it at all, Occam's razor, because to a certain extent it's so embedded in science that we don't notice it's there. So if we have a phenomenon, I don't know, we could, like the cosmic microwave background, or just in my own work, some results from doing some analysis of metabolism of a cell. Sure. And this is another area where it actually comes into my own work. When we look at data, such as we look at metabolites that are generated by cellular metabolism, and try to work out what kind of metabolism is going on in a cell. So we look at the products of the metabolism. We have to build models. And you have to build a model of a cell with a number of enzymes. Enzymes make and break up metabolites. So the question then arises, how big should your model be? So we know that, say, in a microbial cell that I might look at, they make 1,000 different enzymes.
Yep.
So do we need to have 1,000 enzymes in our model? And essentially, it's a question that came up in some discussions with a colleague of mine, Hans Westerhoff, who gave a talk at my university, claiming that Occam's razor has no place in biology because we know biology is complicated. And that's really a misunderstanding of Occam's razor. Occam's razor, in the way it's normally presented, which is entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity, is no claim on the level of complexity of the world. It's a claim for reason, for a particular form of reason, saying that if you don't need something, get it out of your model. So it doesn't say that your model has to be simple. It just says that don't put any more components in the model than those you need. So entities should not be multiplied in a model more than necessity. So the question when you get to any data set is, okay, if I have a model which has one enzyme, it's definitely not going to account for my data, 2 enzymes, 3 enzymes, yes, that's going to get closer and closer. And you can keep on adding more and more enzymes until you've added all 1,000. Now, where do you stop? And in fact, what you do in our work is generally we use Bayesian inference to find a simple, the simplest model. Essentially, you look at all the models and you find the minimum model that can account for the data. Now, Hans Westerhoff's argument was that was wrong. You should always put in more complexity into your models because these enzymes are still there. They might be doing something. The problem I have is that if we take the hypothesis that these extra enzymes that we say Hans would like to have in the models are not actually doing anything, when we solve the problem, we will think that they're doing something because all biological data is messy. It all has noise. This experimental noise is kind of additional degrees of freedom in the data that may not be present in the model because it's just experimental noise. But actually what you do when you fit an overcomplex model to noisy data is you fit the parameters of those enzymes that may not be needed onto the noise. So you get a tight fit, but actually you're mostly fitting noise. And this means that your model is overcomplicated. You might think there are 20 enzymes doing this metabolism when only 5 are actually doing anything, and the rest you're just fitting noise. And this means that your models, if you use all 20 or so, are going to have a poor predictive accuracy. So although you'll be able to fit a particular data set, when you make another prediction, they won't fit it at all because they'll be using these other enzymes which aren't active. So this is a problem in all of science. In fact, it's a problem in everything we do in the world. How complex should our models be? So we use that kind of reasoning all the time. And if you explain it to a scientist, you put it to a scientist in the form, okay, you've got some data. I've got 2 models that will account for this data. There's the simple model. It accounts for your data perfectly well. Here's a more complex model. It's not needed, but it also accounts for your data. Which do you choose? Now, I don't think, no scientist I know who would, given that, would say, oh, I'll take the more complex one. That's religion when you do that. That's what you do in theology. You say, you think something exists just because I'm sure it's there. But in science, we don't do that. We say, no, we're going to pick the model which has the smallest number of parameters that fits the data. And now it's up to you, if you are a disbeliever in this model, to show me some data which means I need another enzyme in the model, say, another parameter. Up till then, I'm going to stick with my simple model. And that's how science has worked from the medieval times, since William of Ockham made this case 800 years ago. And all of the subsequent scientists, Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Newton, Einstein, etc., they all adopted this principle. I mean, when Copernicus first discovered the heliocentric system, he didn't argue that it was actually better than the geocentric system of Claudius Ptolemy. In fact, it wasn't any better than it in terms of making predictions about the star motion of the stars in the sky. it was no better than the geocentric system of Ptolemy. His argument was, no, it's simpler. That's why I like it. And that's why Kepler and Galileo believed it, not because it was more accurate, but because it was simpler. It was only actually after Kepler came up with the elliptical circular orbits that it actually became more accurate. But it was already believed by most astronomers before that. And similarly, Newton, when he discovered his laws of motion, before his laws of motion, there were two sets of laws. There was laws in the heavens. For example, Kepler had come up with some laws that explained the orbits of the planets. But they applied in the heavens. They didn't apply on Earth. And this is what Galileo and then Newton did, found that you could also find laws on the Earth. Most famously, Newton's laws work both in the terrestrial world and in the heavens. So he managed to unify two realms that we thought were distinct, or people thought were distinct. The heavens work by a completely different set of rules, of laws than those on Earth. Newton showed that no, they don't. An apple falls to the ground using the same law, or according to the same law, that the moon goes around the Earth or the Earth goes around the sun. They're described by the same law. And that was such a stunning discovery, that both the heavens, which people didn't really know what was out there in the heavens, but after Newton, they knew that it was made of the same kind of stuff because they behaved by the same laws. Funnily enough, William of Ockham had speculated that many hundred years before, when he said that, as far as I can see, there's no reason to believe that the material in the heavens is any different from the material on Earth. So he had speculated in that direction, but Newton actually showed that it was really true, that they followed the same laws. So these were astounding discoveries, and all of the subsequent scientists, all of science can be seen as a kind of gradual simplification, as Newton managed to unify terrestrial and heavenly law, heavenly motion. The Boltzmann and others brought Newton's laws down to the microscopic realm to explain something like heat, for example. Heat was then an aspect of Newtonian physics, really. And that was a fantastic thing. Suddenly this stuff that people have been arguing about and inventing lots of theories about, caloric or other ideas of entities that explained heat. And no, Boltzmann and others showed that it's actually just Newtonian physics down at the microscopic level. So all of science is follows a kind of unification where stuff that we thought was different becomes the same. And the world becomes simpler. So all of science is a drive towards simplicity. When Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace discovered the law of natural selection, instead of a billion different creations for every species of animal, plant, and microbe on the planet, which was the standard explanation for how the biological world came to be, you have just a single origin of life and speciation, and that's all you need. So it's also extraordinarily simple. The standard model then was worked out on grounds of simplicity, and that unified a lot of different particles into just a single model. And physicists are currently trying to find simpler versions, grand unified theories, which will bring the number of particles down to a smaller particle. So the universe may turn out to be pretty much as simple as it could be, consistent with our existence.
Excellent. As you've been taking the time to research this long history, write the book, so the thoughts come to mind as you're sitting around thinking and about the razor, about just things that are happening in 2021, whether it's pandemics or global warming or what have you. Any interesting Occam's razor related insights to the everyday person that hey, we should be applying?
I describe what first of all, I think it's useful to have a kind of intuitive feeling for how Occam's razor, in its usual sense, there's many different ways of thinking about simplicity, but the way that is most powerful in science is incorporated into Bayesian inference. As we said before, this is a statistical method invented by Thomas Bayes in the 18th century. And although he didn't know it, and it was only really discovered relatively recently, that it actually incorporates Occam's razor. It really depends fundamentally on Occam's razor. And to illustrate it, I'm going to do a little trick. Unfortunately, I don't have my dice with me, which I normally use to do this. But imagine I have in my right hand a normal 6-sided dice. Okay. And in my left hand, I have a 60-sided dice. Okay. So it's a dice which has got 60 facets. So on this dice is written numbers 1 to 6. On this dice is written numbers 1 to 60. Now, if I tell you, out of sight, I'm going to throw one of these dice. So I've only got 2 arms, so it's either going to be one or the other. And I call out a number, and I say, okay, the number that's come up is 29, say. Now, what dice do you say? Is it the 60-sided dice or the 6-sided dice?
60.
60, of course, yeah. But then I do it again. I pick them both up and say I'm going to throw one of these dice, and now I throw a 5. Now, which dice have I thrown?
Based on the amount of, I would think you threw the 6-sided one, just to.
Yes, and why do you think that?
Because the total amount of chances per roll is much less, and it's simpler.
Yeah, it's exactly. We actually intuitively know it, but we don't know we're using it. It actually comes out in Bayesian reasoning as a factor called the likelihood, which is the probability of the data given the model. So the probability of throwing a 5 by a 6-sided dice is 1 in 6. The probability of throwing a 5 by a 60-sided dice is 1 in 60. So although there's an equal probability, a prior probability that I might have thrown the right or the left-handed dice, the 6 or the 60 dice, when the data comes in, it now influences our guesstimate, if you like, because it's still only probabilities. It could be the 60-sided dice, but it's 10 times more likely to have been the 6-sided dice because it has much more a greater probability of generating the data. And that's really what happened in Copernicus's geocentric model compared to the Ptolemaic. The Ptolemaic was very, very complicated, and it could fit the data of the heavenly motions, but it could fit any data of heavenly motions. If the planets and stars had been turning somersaults, they were found some way of fitting it to the data. Whereas the Copernican system, particularly when it was simplified down to Kepler's simple, 9 planets, it was very simple. And it still predicted the data actually better than the Ptolemaic. But even if it was the same level of predictability as the Ptolemaic, it should be chosen because it's simpler. And we know this intuitively, that simpler models, if they do turn up with the right answer, they are the more likely. So that's how Occam's razor usually works. So you've got to then assess the simplicity or complexity of an argument or model. Okay, how do you do that? Well, what I call Occam's pocket razor is that you simply count the words of an explanation. So I apply it to a real life example. So, for example, in the COVID pandemic, now there's a simple explanation that the pandemic was caused by a virus that came from a bat, was transmitted into humans, perhaps involving a lab in between the bat and the human, but that was how it happened. And that's simple. It's easy to say that. Only half a dozen words and you can explain it. You can believe that, or you can believe that the pandemic, the global pandemic, is actually a conspiracy by Bill Gates and his very rich associates to control humanity by injecting microchips into us. That got to do with the virus, because in order to persuade us to be injected, the entire population of the world to be injected so he could control us, he's released a virus into the world. And this virus is the COVID virus, and he's released this virus in order that it will be persuade us all to get vaccinated. And now he's got the medical profession and the pharmaceutical profession on his side making these microchips. And if you really want to complicate the argument more, then he's controlled by lizards from space who are controlling him as well. So you can believe this, but it's a very, very complicated argument to explain all of the different people who've got to be involved in this conspiracy, how it works, the fact no one's actually detected any of these microchips. They'll find some explanation of that. They're all part of the conspiracy. So it's the way that we use Occam's razor is simply counting complexity of arguments. And if someone takes a long time to explain something that you think there's a simpler answer for, choose your simple answer. That's really the message of Occam's razor for the world, if you like, for simple reasoning about the world. Choose the simplest answer, and that's usually the one that's easiest to say in the fewest number of words. I came to this conclusion, again, I come to this at all sorts of angles, when I was astonished to discover that when I met clever creationists, I'm obviously an evolutionist, I believe in evolution, but when I met clever creationists, I could never prove them wrong. I thought I could. I thought, okay, I'll show them a fossil. Here's a fossil. How did you get it? And they say, oh, well, that's easy. That was in Noah's flood. It was these were a creature that was drowned in Noah's flood and is now extinct. I say, okay, but how if I go to, say, the Grand Canyon and you see this great cut through all the layers of the earth, and if you look at different layers, you'll find different fossils and kind of sequences, and they say, oh, that's hydraulic sorting. As everything was sorting after the flood. Some animals fell down faster and others not so fast, and it came into these kind of layers. I said, okay. Well, you think this flood happened around about, I think, 2000 BC or so. That was when the pyramids were built, and wouldn't the pyramid builders in Egypt have noticed that their pyramids were under a mile of water, and maybe noted it in some of their inscriptions? People say this is this time when everything was underwater. No, and they say, oh, you don't believe radiocarbon dating, do you? So, and no matter what I threw at them, you couldn't prove them wrong. And this came as a shock to me. I always thought science was about proving and disproving things. But I discovered I couldn't disprove creationists. And it isn't that and that's not the problem then. You have to shift the problem to realize, okay, they can invent all of these explanations for every bit of data and every reasonable argument that you have. But then their argument is like the 160,000 sided dice. It's a dice so big that it could account for anything. So it's extraordinarily unlikely that it would actually be the model that generated the data that we're seeing. And then we instead see a simple model that's perfectly compatible with natural selection, which is a very simple theory. Yep. So it's this principle, I think, that's the thing to take away, the principle that that we should choose simple solutions, we should use in our life as well. And another example I give, I think, in my book was, as we try to deal with uncomfortable facts. When I was in my younger dating days and you're sitting at waiting for your date to arrive and she doesn't arrive, you start kind of inventing, okay, well, maybe she missed the bus. And then 20 minutes later, she's still not arrived, and you've seen the bus go by. Or maybe she had a phone call, and then you're inventing more and more complicated explanations. But actually, the simple one is the one you should believe. No, she's found someone else and is jilting you. So sometimes we invent complicated explanations to save us from confronting the truth. And I think we have to kind of say, okay, well, there's this explanation, nice and small and simple, or there's this big, ugly explanation, which has got lots of facets to it and requires lots of unlikely things to happen. You can't prove it wrong, but which is the most probable? And so that we need to use in our private life, in all our life, but particularly in our science. Yeah. And it came as a revelation to me, and I think it is probably most scientists who are still not convinced by this, but have not given me a counterexample. That really is all science is, a way of finding our way to the simplest solutions. We use experiment to do that. We use mathematics to do that. But basically, we are looking at the simplest way that we can account for the world. And that's why science works so well, because actually the world is simple. Back to that Neil Turok's observation, the world started off simple. Its bones are simple, and we can try to get our science is all about trying to uncover the the underlying simplicities in the world, and we use those underlying simplicities to make vaccines, to make space rockets, to deliver technology. Those are all because we've discovered these underlying simplicities that we can manipulate to make the technologies that have made the modern world.
Johnjoe, while I have you, there was a news release just a couple of days ago here in the United States that the California Nanosystems Institute at UCLA has just dedicated a new research center to quantum biology. Just a couple words from you on how you see the development of the quantum biosciences occurring. Obviously, it's been in your area for a while, but now spreading over here. You excited about it?
Yeah, very excited. In fact, we have a link with UCLA, Clarissa Yelio at UCLA, who is who we have a close ties with, a collaborative project with, and we run a collaborative seminar series, quantum biology seminar series between us and University of Surrey and Clarissa and her colleagues at UCLA, and anyone can click onto this. If you search on our websites, you'll find links to this seminar series. And it's very exciting. We're finding new areas to work in quantum biology. We have some students in our quantum biology doctoral training center working on vision, working on how drugs are activated, working on lots of different areas. So the science of quantum biology is growing and becoming more exciting, and the first new science of the 21st century. I think there's plenty more going to be happening in the coming months, years, and decades ahead in quantum biology.
Outstanding, outstanding. Johnjoe, it's always wonderful talking to you and listening to your visions about all these topics. Really fascinating. For everybody that's going to be listening to this particular episode on our podcast or watching on the YouTube channel, you've been listening to Professor Johnjoe McFadden, Professor of Molecular Genetics, University of Surrey. Pick up his new book, Life is Simple, How Occam's Razor Sets Science Free and Shapes the Universe. Check out his other books, Quantum Evolution and Life on the Edge. Johnjoe, thank you again for taking the time out of your schedule to talk to us. Thanks for everything that you've been doing. And as we say in our show, thanks for helping to create the better tomorrow through all your ideas.
Thank you. Thank you. You might like to know, I just saw this morning. You can get the audiobook of Life is Simple on Amazon Prime in the US at the moment, free. They're giving it away free. So if you sign on to Amazon
they're keeping it simple.
You can immediately start listening to it. So yeah, hope you enjoy it.
Outstanding. We'll put all the links in the bio. Great seeing you again. Great seeing you.
Thanks a lot. Nice to see you, Ira.